Okay, well, welcome to what may be our last What Physicists Do. When I signed myself up to give the, quote, last lecture of the semester, I was referring to a tradition where people who are going to retire, reflect on their careers. I didn't really think it would be the last lecture. So, I'm very happy to see such a big crowd. I guess I should retire more often. This is definitely the biggest crowd that we've had all semester. So that's 40 years right there. That top picture I got at a party recently given by one of my friends who I work with at UC Berkeley. So that's actually UC Berkeley in the background, not Sonoma State. But when I was working at UC Berkeley, I came and taught at Sonoma State, so it seemed like the right year to choose. Okay, come on in. There you go. So I'm not having anyone introduce me because this whole talk is basically all about me, and that's plenty. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an overview of my timeline at Sonoma State, and I'm going to talk some about teaching, talk some about my research, talk about working with Roseland University Prep, which is one of my all-time favorite places, and then a whole much longer section about all the educational projects we've done. And I will close with some thoughts about the future. So I first came to Sonoma State in March of 1982, and that was the first time I gave a What Physicists Do. And the way that happened was that Joe Ten, who started the series and who was running it at the time, had invited the person I work for at UC Berkeley, Stuart Boyer, to give a What Physicists Do, and he immediately pawned it off on one of his postdocs, which was me. And so I came here, and then the next semester there was a particularly unpopular president that was here who kept firing everybody and moving everybody around. Gee, where have I heard that before? So it was one of those moves. One of the physics faculty ended up being the person that was the dean or the vice president or something. And so then they needed someone to cover his classes. And then Joe reached out to me and said, would you be willing to come up here and teach this class? And this was really quite unusual because I had never actually taught before, certainly not a whole semester class. When I was a grad student at MIT, I was a research assistant. I was not a teaching assistant. So I had actually no experience teaching at all. When I came up here, I taught the 4-unit class. For those of you who are not familiar with all of our numbers, Physics 214 is the second semester calculus-based physics class for a physics major. And I just loved it. I loved every minute of it. And they wanted me to keep doing some part-time lecturing. And I said, well, I have this full-time job at Berkeley, and it's really quite a long drive. And so, if you ever have a tenure-track job, let me know. And then in 1985, they had a tenure-track job. So then they called me up again and said, well, we have this job now, and we would like you to apply for it. And I said, well, but I'm running all this stuff at Berkeley. And they said, well, just apply anyway. So then I did, but we'll continue the story on some more slides. I came here, I got the job. I was hired in at the associate level without tenure. I came here in fall of '86. I got tenure in 1990, full professor in 1991. And then I started the Education and Public Outreach Group in 1999, which was then renamed EdEon STEM Learning in probably 2017 or maybe 2018. Oh, and across the top, you can see the evolution of the SSU logos on the letterhead as well. So then I was looking at my What Physicists Do's because that's where it all started. And if you look from the bottom up, see, so there's the first one. So for the first two, I was still at Berkeley. And then for all of the ones up until about here, 1998, I was still doing research talks. These are all scientific research talks about X-ray or gamma ray astronomy. And you can see even back then, I was really into pulsars and binary pulsars. And then sort of after 1999, when I started the group, if you look at all of those talks, they're really all outreach talks for the various projects I worked on. Except for some of them were my hobbies, like the science of war and peace. That's a talk that I had given in various forms for probably 10 or 15 years in the War and Peace seminar series here on campus that no longer exists. I was the sole science content of that series, and I explained how the theory behind how you make a nuclear bomb, basically, and then what you can do about that. So I've now given, this will be my 13th talk, and plus the first 2, that makes 15. I'm still behind Joe by 1 talk. So this isn't really going to be my last lecture. I'll have to come back at least 2 more times so I can. Okay. Well, when I first came here, I was working at the UC Berkeley Space Sciences Lab for this guy that I mentioned, Stuart Boyer. That was what the lab looked like at the time, or at least that's what it looks like now. And that was the satellite that I was working on, Extreme Ultraviolet Explorer. And then after I applied for the job that I wasn't intending to take, the space shuttle blew up. So the satellite that I had been working on that was supposed to be launched in a year got delayed indefinitely because it was supposed to be launched by the shuttle. And in fact, it was launched on a rocket. But my bet with myself was, this is like a cosmic sign to change careers. I bet I'll get tenure before that satellite gets launched. And I did. I won the bet with myself. So, and I've never regretted coming here. It's been a blast. But the other catch was, I was hired specifically to teach electronics classes. And at the time, I was managing about 70 scientists, engineers, and programmers on the satellite project, and learning a whole bunch about hardware by managing people who actually knew how to do hardware and electronics. And I said to the folks on the hiring committee, well, can't you find somebody who actually knows electronics to teach these classes? I'm really a software kind of person. My PhD thesis was software, and that's, sort of was my comfort zone. And they said, well, we tried last year, but the search failed. So if you're willing to do it, we would like you to apply and come here. So that all worked out. I quit the job at Berkeley in the summer and spent the summer teaching myself digital electronics and then started teaching it in the fall, along with 3 other classes. So that was very exciting, doing all those preps. But through the years, when I was still teaching, I taught the whole physics course sequence. So I never taught 114, which is the first semester lecture class. 116 is the lab. I taught 214 in its lab. 216, I taught 314 many times, which is the 3rd semester physics class. And then I taught mathematical physics. I taught statistical physics. And back then, you could actually make up new courses and get them approved. And then your majors could take them. And you could actually do it fast enough that people would be interested in the subject. So, for example, 2 of the classes that I made up that had never been taught before, one was Physics of the Nuclear Age, which was a direct outgrowth of the War and Peace lectures that I had been giving. I thought, wouldn't this be really important to have a whole semester for physics majors where we could really talk about the science of how all these things work and are done. And so then I also taught a class called Theory of Signal Processing, which was in the catalog, I think, but no one had ever really taught it. And I just basically made up my own class, which I told the students was everything I wish that someone had taught me in college because they expected me to know these things when I got to graduate school. And so it was things like chi-square fitting, which one of my students this year was doing, Chris. And it was things like Monte Carlos and how to do statistical error determinations and how to propagate errors and just also how to do numerical coding, like how to solve problems numerically on a computer. So there were all these very useful things that I taught in that class, but those classes went out of the catalog and were canceled many, many budget cuts ago. So as we were forced to trim our major, which used to have 128 units down to 120 units. We had to give up some actual core physics as well, not just these enrichment classes. And then since I am officially an astrophysicist, I did teach some astronomy. But the interesting thing is I never taught the beginning astronomy class, Astronomy 100, because it was too big. And also because it had a lot to do about the solar system and planets and all that stuff that I actually have never worked on and never learned. So it seemed better for me just to stick to the upper division astro classes where I actually knew the material. And teaching cosmology made me realize there was no good textbook for cosmology, but that's a part of a different story. Then we also did things like when I would have grant-funded projects that we wanted to teach teachers, a lot of times the teachers would like to get continuing education credits for the participation in basically 2 weeks worth of sort of online, sort of hybrid kind of things at a time before those things, before Zoom and all that even existed. We did 2 classes for LIGO, 2015, before the discoveries. The 2016 class was sort of after the discoveries. We did a class for NASA called NASA's Multi-Wavelength Universe. So we were able to work, since this physics department and astronomy department does not have a master's program, these people needed graduate credits for their continuing education. So we made a deal with the Department of Education here, and they awarded the credits and let me be the teacher, even though I wasn't in their department. And then, of course, I also was heavily involved in formalizing the course that was started by Jeremy Qualls and So-Young Han, called Dream, Make, and Innovate, which is the class in the makerspace. That was one of the projects that I worked on with Jeremy. So here's some example projects from the Science 220 class when I ran it. It was a service learning class, and what we were doing was we had community partners that were that we got to choose from a list that was maintained by what was then the Center for Community Engagement. That's another thing that's gone now. And they had a community partner, and they'd meet with their community partners and figure out what the person, the group needed. And then they would try to solve the problem or try to make something or a model of something in the makerspace that could possibly help with the problem. So the one on the left is, because we certainly didn't have a budget to actually build a huge playground for goats, is a 1/64th scale model of a goat playground that they designed. That was sort of cute. I guess the people got to go out and meet the goats. That was fun. We had a very interesting mix of artists and engineers in the class. And so the engineers wanted to do stuff with Arduinos. And so like one project, for example, was an Arduino-based weather station. And then we had another community partner who worked a lot with the homeless community in the county. And so we had a few different ones. There were waterproof pants. There was with a leash attached and a way to undo the back without having to take your pants down. And then there was a waterproof pup tent for your pup. When you're homeless, it's good to have shelter. Anyway, that was definitely a fun class about which I knew very little at the time that I took it on. So what about teaching innovations? Early on, one of the first couple years I was here, someone came to visit the math department, and I looked everywhere to see if I could figure out the name of the person or the article that I wrote about him afterwards. But alas, this is in the age before the internet. And so if you don't have a paper copy of something, you're never going to find it again. So I was not able to figure out the name of the guy. It was something like Clarence Parker or Clarence Page or something. But he gave this amazing talk about active involvement in learning. And until that time, my teaching had basically just reflected how I was taught, which is somebody stands up there and talks at you, and you take notes and try to understand what they're saying. And the problem with that is, as I explained to my students, if I work a problem out on the board, what have you learned? You have learned that I know how to solve the problem. You have not learned how to solve the problem yourself. And that's the problem that a lot of physics majors have, is because they think, oh, it looks so easy when the teacher does it, and then they try to do it themselves, and you don't even know where to start. And that's certainly the same struggle that I went through when I was learning physics myself. So I began this crusade to increase the active involvement in learning in all of our classes by having what I called in-class problems. So I would talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'd hand out a problem about the stuff I just talked about. And the students would work in small groups, and then they would be able to quickly figure out whether or not they knew how to do that problem. And in fact, they mostly always didn't. And so it was good, because I could go around and sort of coach, but not really give the answers to the different groups until finally people started getting the hang of this and got better. So I did that for all the upper division physics classes that I taught, because those are really the hardest ones, as I'm sure the physics majors here will agree. Other fun things I did was with my colleague, Professor John Dunning here, Professor Emeritus, we rewrote all the 116 labs. Now, you have to remember, 1986, 1987, this is still before the internet. The internet was not invented until 1989. We had Apple II computers in the labs. We thought we were doing pretty good by having those, right? It just seems funny now. When I was hired, I requested that the university buy me a Mac because Macs had just come out. And I was the first person that ever actually negotiated anything for being hired. They actually bought me a computer, and everybody was shocked that I got that as part of being hired. Now, of course, you always try to give people money for startups or buy them computers or whatever if you're trying to hire faculty. Another great colleague that I had was Annalise Phillips, who totally saved me when I got stuck teaching the maker class without knowing anything about it because of Jeremy and So Young moving to Maine. So I was so happy to have found Annalise. She ran a makerspace at the Bay Area Discovery Museum down in Sausalito for little kids, but they had a lot of the same equipment that we had here, and she knew how everything worked. And she also knew how to write up labs that would be able to be used, so we just paid her off the grant to write the labs up. I had sort of thought that when they moved to Maine, I would be left with 15 labs since they had been teaching the class for a while, and there were 2 write-ups. So we redid them all, and then we did 13 more. Basically the same topics, but actual write-ups of labs, and I think they're probably still in use to some degree. I'd have to ask Karen Target about that and see if she's still using them, but they were quite good. But probably the most unusual thing that I did was we were drowning in 210 students. 210 is the year-long course for non-physics majors that doesn't have calculus. So it's first-year physics, 2 semesters with labs, but no calculus, just algebra and trig. And that's the class that all the biology majors take. It's the class that anybody would take that is not going to be a physicist or an engineer, because the other departments around here don't require calculus. So I decided that for a lot of the people that were in the 210 class that were not pre-med, so the people that wanted to go to other disciplines, like maybe they wanted to go into physical therapy or they wanted to be a coach, lots and lots of kinesiology majors, this was the class they took. They were not very happy trying to be in one huge class competing with the pre-meds who all wanted A's. So my version was using this book called Physics by Inquiry that was written by Lillian McDermott from the University of Washington, and her whole physics education research group. She's really the person that started PER, as far as I can tell. At least in my mind, that's where I learned most of what I learned about hands-on learning. And so I did the Physics by Inquiry version of that class for like 25 people, labs worth. Because I took the 3 units of lecture and the 3 hours of lab, and I held classes for 6 hours during the week, and we just did the Physics by Inquiry curriculum. So no lecturing on my part, really. People are working through the books, they're answering questions, they're doing everything by hand, lots of kinesthetic kind of activities. And that was so perfect for this group of students who were just terrified of physics and all the math, because they really got actively involved in the class and they were really able to do hardware kinds of things. And so it just solidified my belief that people have to be actively involved in learning, and the more hardware and coding you can do, the better for you. And so that's a philosophy that I have tried to impart to everyone I've worked with since then, whether they're students or whether they're the staff in my group. Very essential. And then, of course, I also started doing this amazing project, and I didn't even realize that I started it literally right when I started working here. The first grant that I wrote to get money for this big project, which went on for 6 years, was received in October of 1986. I was looking at my records. We got a bunch of small grants from the National Society of Physics Students. The Parker Hannafin Foundation gave us drive motors. We got a lot of help, donated help from the Hewlett-Packard engineers, who at that point were across the street, and Clyde Underwood, who was one of our graduates from this department, had always wanted to do this. So he didn't make it into any of the pictures, unfortunately. But the original group of people that I was working with, Dan Nottingham, he went off to Boston eventually. Now, I don't know what happened to Martin. And then this just shows you how great the newspaper is. She was not a graduate student. We don't have graduate students. Anyway, but Susie was a wonderful student. And ultimately, when we started doing observations with the thing at sort of the end of the 6-year period, we could see the top 10 radio sources in the sky, right? It was the very small array because it was just two 10-foot dishes, one on either end of Darwin. I was very pleased that they built Darwin in the proper direction so that as the Earth turned, the fringes pattern would just, the sources would just drift through the beams and we get this lovely fringe pattern. And then I think I presented this material at the American Astronomical Society meeting one year, and that was where I met Steve Marin, who was the press officer for the society at that time. And so he featured our work with the very small array as one of the press conferences, and I thought, oh, this is really fun. And then after that, I think, is when the Press Democrat wrote the article. And it's just one of many pictures of me posing next to a telescope, none of which I've ever used. But I've posed by a lot of them, and this was one of the first. If you go up to the hallway outside of EdEon on the 3rd floor of Schultz, there are pictures from SSU's first 30 years. I'm the only one that's in any of those pictures that's still here. And it's a picture from 1989 of me and a bunch of students posing with the telescope. So I got my first research grant here in 1987. And it sure seemed like a lot of money back then, $53,000, wow. It was a guest observer grant from NASA to analyze data from a high energy satellite. And then the next interesting article that came out next year makes it look like the $53,000 grant was a $3.5 million grant, the way they wrote it. And so they put me there, even though my grant was the same $53,000. And then they decided that NASA had given me the money to build the radio telescope. Totally not true. So more excellent reporting from the campus newspaper. But a sidelight of this that I know Gordon Spear will appreciate, because later we wrote a grant that brought him the second one. With that grant, I bought a Model 100 Sun workstation, which was the first Unix machine to come on campus. And this was around 1988 or so, and then by the next year, the internet had been invented, and people needed to have Unix email servers. This campus was still running a CDC mainframe at the time. And so I was the only one with a Unix machine on campus. I graciously allowed them to use my machine, which was named Charmian. You may still see that as part of my email on occasion, because Charmian turned into Universe because everybody thought Charmian was chairman. And I hadn't even been department chair yet. It was too confusing. So I was naming all my computers after local Sonoma County famous people. So we had a Ripley, a Perry, a Charmian, all the different kinds of famous Sonoma County people. But yeah, I let the campus use my Unix machine to be the campus email server. And I was quite a good Unix sysadmin back then. That will be surprising to the people that work for me now. But I still remember a lot of the stuff. And then I got tenure in 1990. So here's some very nice pictures from the tenure party. Garrett and I threw the party at Truffles, which is a restaurant in Sebastopol that no longer exists. And so you can see what everybody looked like back then. There's Joe, there's Gordon, there's me. Saeed Rahimi was actually still our colleague before he went into the administration. There's Professor Dunning, and then Duncan Poland, who has sadly passed. And then in the next picture is Steve Anderson and his wife, Joanne Del Corral. She has also passed, very sadly. And Bob Sherman, who was the dean at the time, and I'm guessing that's Mrs. Sherman, as I don't know who that is. And then also the president of the university at the time, David Benson, came, and I'm guessing that was his wife. So Joe can tell me if I'm right or not. Okay, Joe says I'm right. Yay, okay, so that's good. This was really a fun party. I was very pleased to be able to share that event with everybody. And it's just sort of amazing. So David Benson was the president after the terrible president that I mentioned before. The terrible president laid off a lot of tenured faculty. His name was Peter Diamandopoulos. And the university was put on the blacklist by the American Association of University Professors for a good 20 years, at least after that. And David Benson was a professor in the kinesiology department, so he was an insider, and he actually got named to be president, the next president, to clean up the big mess left over by Diamandopoulos. Oh, I guess that doesn't happen anymore. So 1992 to 1993, the academic year, That was a real banner year. It was the year that I won the SSU Outstanding Professor Award. Then I won the California Professor of the Year Award from this group called CASE. Then I was shortlisted for the ongoing dean search for natural sciences. Bob Sherman had retired. And I was on sabbatical at SLAC, which led to my involvement in the Gamma Ray Large Area Space Telescope that was later renamed Fermi. When I didn't get the dean job, I decided, well, I guess I do not want a career in academic administration because it would make me have to move, and then I'd have to leave Sonoma State, and I really didn't want to do that. So I took the money that they gave me for the Outstanding Professor Award, and I bought my horse. That's Hannah. Seemed like a good thing to do. I was, the year that I turned 40, it was my midlife crisis. No red sports car for me, I just wanted a horse. And then I just started getting awards and fellowships and more awards and more fellowships. And I'm surprised I could actually fit them all on one page. But these are just the individual awards. The team awards would take another whole page. The first award, the California Council on Science and Technology, President Arminiana put me up for. And my advice about awards is, if you want to win awards, start with a small one. And then, see what else can happen. So once you start getting awards, then people see you're an awardee, and then they want to give you more awards. And sometimes they even come with money and not just a piece of glass. But I do have quite a lovely glass collection in my office up in EdEon. In particular, when I finally, after the 5th time I was nominated, got the Wong Family Excellence Award in 2016, that's the picture that went with that award. That one came with $20,000, and I was like, well, I'm glad I kept applying. So, you see, persistence. Nevertheless, she persists, right? The most recent one is just this past year. I've been a member of Sigma Xi, which is the National Honor Society, since I got my PhD in 1981. And they decided they would make me a fellow of their society, and I happened to be in Washington at the time for a NASA meeting. So we went to the ceremony, and it was quite a lovely ceremony. Tim and I went. Oh, and here's some photos. So Chancellor White and I got to actually be on really pretty good terms, and he came and visited after I got the Wong Award down in Long Beach. The Cal Academy Fellowship ceremony was something like October 11th or 12th in 2017. So if anybody was living here in 2017, they'll remember the Tubbs fire started on the 9th. And so, Petaluma was okay, where I lived was okay, so we drove to this award ceremony in the city because, there's nothing I could do at home. Nothing was burning right by my house. And ended up meeting Lisa McKaylee, who was the director of Pepperwood at the time. And she knew that my telescope had not burned down, and she was able to tell me that it was still there, which was very exciting. The award that I got from the International Astronautic Federation for my work doing, aerospace-related stuff, I got to go to Adelaide, Australia to pick up, and that was an amazing adventure. And, well, Texas for the AAS Education Prize, not the most exciting place to be. This one was at least in downtown DC, and plus they gave me this super cool sash, which I am going to wear on Saturday for graduation, because I just had like a normal sash, and now I have a pretty fancy sash to put on top of it. Oh, and yeah, that one was a really fun party too, the Women in Aerospace Award. That one was also in DC. So I started working with Roseland University Prep in 2005. The high school was started in 2004. If you haven't heard of Roseland University Prep, it's basically over 95% high needs Hispanic students. And the goal is to get everybody to go to college. And then the goal later was to get everybody to get through college, because getting them to college, then they weren't doing so well, and so we had to amp up the support efforts for those students. But I just loved everybody at the school so much. It was so much fun working with them. We started an after-school science club that was run by one of my staff at the time. That eventually morphed into Mesa School's program. And, I had some pictures here. So, and their first graduates, since they started in 2004, their first graduates of the school that could go to college came out in 2008. and a lot of them came here. Roseland University Prep, 95% of their students meet the A through G requirements to go to to go to a UC or a CSU campus. There's no other school in Sonoma County that has better than 30 or 35%. No other public school. Sonoma Academy, I'm sure, does very well. But it's just, the kids are, these students are just amazing. And I wanted to do everything I could to encourage them to come here. So it turns out that when you look at the literature for retaining college students, what are the best things you can do to make a college experience successful for somebody or get them to go to college? The most important factor is whether they have ever been on a college campus before. They then come. And so for students with no money, they can't just go flying all around the country looking at a bunch of different colleges like I'm sure some of you were able to do. So we had this summer weekends, and they were actually funded by the tribe. The Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria gave me the money to put on this program. And we had 3 days of programming, so the students could go take little mini classes given by all sorts of different professors who all volunteered to do that. You can see me watching some students coding. Dr. Kevin McLinn, who was part of my group at the time, took everybody to the observatory and helped them with the telescope. But we did this 2 different summers in a row leading up to when the first students from Roseland would really be attending here. Once they knew somebody else had been here, it wasn't so scary anymore, right? But for those first students that were living up to these incredible expectations placed by this charter public school district, it was pretty scary. The parents, were briefed, and we had chaperones everywhere, and they were especially worried about their daughters in the dorms and things like that. But we had no untoward events. It was a great success, and Roseland University Prep is still the #1 feeder of any given high school to this university in terms of enrollment. We got 15 or 20 kids from Roseland every year. There's no other school that sends us, high school, even locally, that sends us more than a few, more than 2 or 3. So, still like to work with Roseland. I was on their charter school board for a couple years, but then I had to step down. So then that takes us to all the stuff I've done in education and public outreach, which the group was called that for about this many years and a few more years after that. But these were what we call the 1% days. We fondly refer to them as the 1% days. NASA started a whole new industry of education and public outreach by saying that 1% of every satellite's budget had to go into education and public outreach. And so I was already working on FERMI with the people from Stanford, where I had had my sabbatical. I was also then asked to lead SWIFT. Various satellites came to me and said, wouldn't you like to lead this? You're at a place, you teach, and you did all this press stuff. You should know how to do this. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. All of a sudden, my grant money, which was between $50,000 and $100,000 a year to do research, jumped to $1 million. And I'm like, I better figure out what to do with all this money, or it's going to be a terrible waste. So I had to start hiring people. I started the group with a fellow scientist from NASA Goddard named Laura Whitlock, not to be confused with the good Laura that we have here. And our very first employee was intended to be somebody to do administration. But in walked Aurora Simonette, who had this amazing portfolio of drawings, and she was sent to me by her advisor from UC Santa Cruz, who knew that I was going to get all this money to do work for Fermi. And she said, well, don't you want to hire an artist? And I said, well, no, I need a secretary. So the deal was she could be a half-time artist and a half-time secretary until I got enough money for her to then become a full-time artist. But that only took 1 year. And then we hired another person to be the admin. And that was fine. Ultimately, I ended up running the education and public outreach programs for 4 different satellites. XMM Newton, I didn't list there. And then we got other money from NASA to do other things, like the Big Ideas in Cosmology project, which I'll show you a little bit about maybe. And then I started working on hardware projects. I was so motivated and inspired by all of the hardware classes that I was teaching here, and it made me really get over my imposter syndrome once I started actually doing it myself, that I thought, everybody just needs to know how to do hardware. So everyone in the group, well, 5 of us anyway, all started learning how to build rockets and getting rocket certifications to do rocket launches. And that was the S4 project, Small Satellites for Secondary Students and Rising Data. And at the same time, I was writing proposals to the National Science Foundation because everybody really, and I was on the advisory committee for LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. And there were lots of people that wanted to learn about LIGO and wanted to learn about general relativity and how it was going to test general relativity. But there was nobody at the community college level that had that GR background, because most of the community college instructors do not have PhDs, they have master's degrees. So GR was not something that they were familiar with or comfortable with. So I wrote a grant to NSF to make online courses for these master's prepared community college teachers to learn all this stuff so that they could then explain what I was hoping would be amazing LIGO discoveries to their students. And then, of course, LIGO made the amazing discoveries. So that was good. I also wrote 2 big proposals for the School of Natural Science, which by then was called the School of Science and Tech. The first one became the Science 120 course, the watershed year. It's a survey of all the different STEM departments with labs for each one. So undeclared majors with good backgrounds, good math backgrounds would come in, and we would try to convert them into any one of the actual departments that were co-sponsoring the course. And that actually worked. We have statistical studies that showed that that worked. At the time, the largest major at Sonoma State was undeclared. A third of the students were undeclared. And a lot of them had really good math backgrounds. So they were perfect candidates to, latch on to some STEM department here. And we were giving them this overview so they could decide which one worked for them the best. And then because of all the hardware building and stuff that I was doing over in my group, Jeremy and So Young decided that they wanted to have a makerspace here on campus. And so they started working on the proposal, which they didn't win until I helped them rewrite the proposal and ended up being partly responsible for it, that brought in all the equipment to the makerspace. And the library was wonderful because they gave us this great room and they painted it and fixed the floor and everything. And we were able to buy furniture with money from the Chevron grant that goes to the library. And I'm sure people have been to the makerspace now. It's got even more stuff in it. But that was a really cool thing that I was very happy to be able to do for the campus. So here's some pictures from the early days of the early 1% days. Here's some of the things we did. There's our first booth that Aurora designed, and she's even in there with Laura Chase, who was our admin, and Sarah Silva, who is a physics grad from this department, who was my project manager at the time. We did, really, Aurora and Kamal did this weekly webcomic called Epos Chronicles, where this alien is trying to understand where they came from. And it's in 4 different languages. And it was very out of date when COVID happened and we didn't have any work to do. So we redid the whole site, fixed all the links, took out, some anachronisms and things like that. And we still have it, and it's in 4 different languages. So feel free to go check that out online. We did lots and lots of curriculum guides, developed a lot of different curriculum for people. This is just a few of them. But I'm particularly proud of the Monster of the Milky Way and the Black Holes, the Other Side of Infinity planetarium show that we did. I took money from the Fermi EPO program as seed funding, and then we wrote a bigger proposal to the National Science Foundation to get the rest of the money. And I was working with a guy named Tom Lucas, who's actually a director and producer and knows how to do planetarium shows and TV shows. I do not know that. I was the science advisor and the first funder. But it turned out really well. The planetarium show has Liam Neeson as the narrator. And so you may still be able to see it around here. It was at Chabot for a while, but mostly it was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and a bunch of other bigger places around the country. And here's some more pictures. We had an educator ambassador teacher training program. So we would train the master teachers, they would train the other teachers. We would add up how many people came to their workshop. And during the years we did this, it was about 70,000 teachers that we trained to use the NASA materials that we were developing. And then Aurora also made these amazing things like the paper model of Swift and a game for Fermi and a whole bunch of other stuff. You can see more of them on the posters in the EdEon hallway. And we did the big ideas in cosmology curriculum. I got a grant for some of it, and Fermi paid for the rest of it. And we're still trying to get it to work properly on LibreText.org. One of the students now, Ben, has been helping find everything that's wrong with it, and we're hoping to get editing permission soon so we can go in there and fix it all. But yes, we supported Swift. The most recent thing that happened with Swift was I got to go to Florence, otherwise known as Firenze in Italy, and go to the Swift 20th anniversary meeting. We made a wonderful website about it. Troy did that. You can go look at it. It's still up there. And I was very happy that I was able to go. The people that worked on Swift for NASA were not allowed to go. They all had their travel orders canceled by the current government. So the principal investigator of Swift actually paid for his trip with his own money so that he could be there. Turns out every 5 years when they have a Swift anniversary conference, it's always in Italy because Swift was built by Italy, UK, and the US. And Italy's a much more fun place to go for conferences. And Fermi got launched 4 years later. For both satellites, I was one of the only people that was able to stay around long enough at Cape Canaveral to see the actual launch, because everybody would come and then it would get delayed, and they'd have to go home after a few days to a week. And because I was doing the press office stuff, I had to stay. So I had a more expensive plane ticket. I just kept changing it until the stuff was finally launched. But both launches were pretty spectacular. I'm not really going to talk about any of the science because that's a totally different talk that I've given many times. Another fun thing I did was use NASA money, about $100,000 to start with, to build a research-grade telescope that could be controlled robotically. And we put it up at the Pepperwood Preserve, which is north of Santa Rosa. So it's darker, it's up a little higher, gets the fog a little later than on campus. And it's been used by quite a number of people now, and amazingly survived the Tubbs fire, unlike the observatory next to it, which had a classical Clark refractor telescope that just melted and that whole building just burned down. Somehow the new dome that I had bought as the 1% days were ending and I had a bunch of money to spend out, our old dome was not working. It wouldn't close, it wouldn't rotate, it was just wouldn't stay round. So I bought this new dome, which has been fabulous and which protected the thing from the fire. And I sent the pictures to the guy we bought it from, and he was so pleased. And there was when we finally got back up there in about December of 2017, there was not even any ashes inside the dome. Everything in the dome was fine. There was a little bit of ash around the outside of the dome, in this building that had totally been burned down right next to it. Of course, the fire did burn out all the power lines and all the internet lines, and it took us about another year to get those put back because we had to wait for PG&E. And they were a little busy. So the whole point of having this telescope was to do coordinated observations between the high-energy satellites and things on the ground. So we were studying things that changed in time, like gamma ray bursts, big blasts of gamma rays, flares from blazars, things like that. So that was fun, and Kevin McLinn was the GORT director for pretty much that whole time and made that all happen. And I'm very pleased to say that he's back working with the group again. And then we started really getting serious about rockets. So the first rocket program, once about 4 of us had gotten our level 2 rocket certifications, was based on something that Bob Twiggs had been doing with a club that I had joined, the rocket club called AeroPac. That's our local rocket club. And the idea is the students will build the payloads, the club would launch the rockets. They're high-powered rockets. You have to be more than 18 years of age to be able to build them. And then the students would get the data, and then they would analyze the data. So we were flying all sorts of environmental sensors, temperature, pressure, humidity, altitude, whatever. And they could look for correlations and things as the payload came back down to the ground from the rocket. But what really happened was the students all wanted to build the rockets, too. They really like building things. And so ultimately, they did build some of their own rockets, and then they were just supervised by the club members when they came to launch them. And also in 2015, this program started around 2013, In 2015, NASA stopped sponsoring the Team America Rocketry Challenge, and there was no competition. So they asked us to put on the competition through the S4 program, which we did. And so we all went back to Black Rock, and we watched the students who had built these amazing rockets and payloads, and then we judged them and gave out prizes. But that was me with my level 2 rocket. There's actually a skinny rocket in between the launch wheels. That's the rocket right there. And I was encouraging it to go that way. So then the next project I did was funded through the Minority University program at NASA, MUREP. And I was working with the community colleges, in particular Napa Valley College, because this was a program that was for community colleges, the thing I applied to, developing a curriculum that would encourage people to do more NASA-related things in their lives. And they wanted, the PI had to be from the community college, and the PI had to have a PhD, which is actually not very common. But I found one, and that was Erin Quealy. And so she became the head of this project, even though I'm the only one that knew what the project was and did all the writing and did all the work. And so she got to learn how to do this one. With S4, the previous program, we did balloons and rockets, tethered balloons and high-powered rockets. With Rising Data, we did drones and then lower-powered rockets. Because these people, being college students, were more than 18, they could build and fly their own rockets without having to have an adult present. And then we had them fly the payloads on the drones first, so that if the rocket blew up, they'd still have their payload. And maybe it wouldn't, maybe if they crash landed their drone, it wouldn't really be damaged too much. But that was a lot of fun. And so then that led us into building satellites. So we went, we worked our way up. Right now I've done a radio telescope, I built an optical observatory, but I'm an X-ray astronomer. I wanted to build satellites, but you couldn't build amateur level satellites until about 2013 or 2011. I mean, the whole concept of a small CubeSat, a nano satellite, didn't even exist because the chips and the technology weren't there. But by 2013, they started making everything small enough and with less power requirements so you could actually build some stuff. So the first satellite that we built was called T-Logo Cube because it flew the logo language. It was a pocket cube, not a CubeSat. It was built on a 5-centimeter cube, not a 10-centimeter cube like regular CubeSats. The Sonoma State students were responsible for building the whole thing. And so here's just some pictures of that. Kevin Zach was the student lead. He later went off to graduate school, and now he's working at the Laboratory for Laser Energetics at the University of Rochester. There's Bob Twiggs. He's the T in T-Logo Cube. He's the father of CubeSats in general, with another professor from Cal Poly named Jordy. But those two people get credit for the whole CubeSat concept. But Bob went on further because then he made the pocket cube concept that was even smaller. And then he made the ThinSat concept that was even smaller. So your whole payload and everything is like a matchbook when people used to have matchbooks. And then because this was not funded by NASA, this was actually funded by my late husband, Garrett, who's that person there, by his IRA. He took money out of his IRA so we could have the money to buy all the parts. We built the ground stations at my ranch. So that is a picture of our physics graduates, Hunter Mills, Ben Cunningham, Kevin Zach, their friend Aaron Pacheco, who came here for a little while but never finished, Steve Anderson, our department's fabulous technician, there's Garrett, and there's me. Posing with the first ground station at the ranch. Well, that's great, but the satellite was going to pass overhead like a couple times a day, and one of the times is I was in the middle of the night. So you needed to have somebody looking at the data when the satellite came over your ground station to make sure everything was working, which led to Kevin Zach sleeping on the couch in my living room for a very long time, at least about 2 months until the satellite stopped working. And also led us to build our next ground station here on campus on the roof of a building. So 2013 was another one of these years where a lot of stuff happened. We successfully launched T-Logo Cube, and it worked for about 2 months. I got NSF funding to do the LIGO work. NASA ended the 1% days, sending us all into an extreme panic because we thought everybody was going to lose their jobs because I didn't know where the money was going to come from to pay all the people who were working for me back then. Then they changed their minds, and they didn't really zero us out. They gave us enough money to let us limp along until we could write new proposals to do something. But in that year, I wrote something like 8 proposals in 3 months to try to bring in enough money to save the group. And the only one that was large enough to save us was from the US Department of Education, something I'd never dealt with before. You read their solicitations for funding, and it's like another language. I had no idea what they were even talking about most of the time. Very different from NASA or the National Science Foundation grants that I had been writing. And the person who was running the Office of Research and Sponsored Projects here on campus at the time, when I went in to say, do you have anything I can apply to that's going to get me like $1 million so I can keep all my staff? And he said, well, there is this thing from the Department of Ed, but there's a pre-proposal, and you have to have a track record with the Department of Ed to even apply. And my track record was not anywhere near the Department of Ed. But Susan Wanling, who is the director of pre-college programs, she also wanted to apply to this thing, and she had the track record with the department because she'd been running pre-college programs, and it's all funded by the Department of Ed. So we collaborated together because she knew the schools and I knew what I wanted to do, and that turned into the Learning by Making program. So we won. They accepted 16 out of 663 proposals, and we won. First time. I was in hysterics. I was sobbing. I was screaming. I was jumping up and down. We're saved. We're saved. So we had a 5-year grant, and we did a good job. And so, but we still weren't really ready to take it to the next level. So then we got another 5-year grant, so-called early phase grant, in 2018. And by the end of that one, we pretty much, so 10 years I worked developing this curriculum. We had a really solid entire curriculum for an entire year of 9th grade. And we had this amazing web app and hardware interface that was developed by one of our graduates who was my staff member by then, Casey Lewiston, that we called the web app. And it was just great. I mean, we were sad that more people didn't want to teach it, but that's, I guess, the problem when you have an entire year-long curriculum. Plus, it didn't help us that the standards in the world changed, and what was integrated science, and we thought it was a great idea to integrate science, went away, and they went back to siloing biology, chemistry, physics, earth science kind of thing. So I think maybe I'll just show you this video. It's only 1.5 minutes.
Ever wondered how evaporation works? Or how to harness sunlight? At Learning by Making, we explore these questions and more.
I love the water and soil unit because students get their hands dirty, literally. We start by talking about sweating and how it cools us down. Students aren't really sure how this works until we run the evaporation experiment with water and fans. This allows them to see for themselves how matter carries energy into and out of systems. We follow this by learning about the water cycle and how water flows through our environment and our lives. Once students are grounded in watersheds, it's time for the mud. We build models of a watershed with aluminum clouds hanging above different soils and ground cover cascading into aquifer and runoff basins below. This is by far the students' favorite part. They love working with the elements, germinating seeds and seeing the water flow through these systems.
Engage in the full scientific process, from posing questions to communicating results, all while building excitement and realistic expectations for a future in science. Learning by Making, where science meets wonder.
Anyway, Derek was one of our favorite teachers, so that was great. So yes, I was worried that I would be running out of time, and in fact I am, but we'll just keep going anyway. So this was the NSF grant that I got to work on with LIGO, with our 2 online courses. We also made a really cool video explaining how LIGO really works and put out an educator's guide for high school and middle school teachers. And then after that, LIGO won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017. So at least the three of the old guys that started it won it. But we got to celebrate it at Sonoma State because in March of 2018, the campus was reopened, the fire was gone. We were really worried. But we hosted the March 28 meeting of the LIGO-Virgo collaboration. We had about 400 scientists from all over the world come here during spring break. And there was our photo booth with the robot cat, because there was a whole cat theme going on for this conference because Aurora designed all the stuff for the conference. But we also let people pose with Aurora's cover art from the Merging Binary Neutron Star Nature magazine. So that was fun. And then everybody got super dressed up for the banquet, which was at the Doubletree. And and this guy should look familiar to everybody. Ryan, who is a student here and is now our department technician. You probably won't know those two. They graduated. There's Kip Thorne and there's me, and we were all dressed up, and Kip sat at the table with us and the students, and it was just a very lovely occasion. Well, in 2018, the EPO group, which was never a very good name, became EdEon STEM Learning, because Laura got hired and she decided the EPO group is a stupid name. And she had a much better name for her previous group at Berkeley, which was Multiverse. But we couldn't use that because she already did. So we just made up words, and finally we got one that we liked. And so for those of you who are wondering what EdEon stands for, it's Education Through the Eons, because we like to cover everybody from K through Gray. So Laura has been, for the past almost 8 years, the Associate Director of EdEon and the day-to-day project manager. But this year, she's getting promoted to director because I am going to be retiring, and I'll become Director Emeritus. And we have also hired a new Associate Director, who I think I saw snuck in here. She's here somewhere. Oh, she's in the back, I think, somewhere. Where? Oh, there you are. Okay, Raquel Holmes. Everybody look at Raquel, say hi, because you haven't met her yet. Raquel is the daughter of one of the first faculty that I met when I first got hired and hung around here. Her father was Lavelle Holmes. And I had been to her house before I ever even met her because I had been there when he was still living there. So that was fun. But we also, so here's our current staff. As you can see, we have a lot of people now. And this doesn't count the 10 to 15 undergrads that work for us at any given time, the 30 or more special consultants that are the teachers that we pay and various other helpers that we pay, or the NASA subject matter experts that we work with. So yeah, we have quite a large scope and a lot of people. And then we kept building satellites once we became EdEon. So here is, and I know some people met him at the Stanford talk by Giorgio Grada, but this is what little Glenn looked like back then, and now he's like well over 6 feet. I can't call him little Glenn anymore, but his dad is a psychology professor here. And so he just basically started coming to Sonoma State classes and working on the satellite project with my late husband. And there it is in the launch dispenser, about ready to go to up to the space station. But unfortunately, it got boosted up into the higher orbit around the end of January 2020. And so we were trying to talk to it, it wasn't answering us. We decided we needed to build a bigger antenna, which we eventually did, but not until June. And then the antenna here on the ground station here on campus was on the roof of the Student Center. But you all know what happened in March 2020. The campus shut down for COVID. So we couldn't even get access to our ground station that we expected to be talking to it with. So we started build another one at the ranch, but ultimately we were unsuccessful in building it. And now Laura is leading a project to build our third CubeSat, which with any luck will be launched sometime later this year, maybe. We're keeping our fingers crossed. This one is a partnership with Howard University and the University of New Hampshire. And the other thing that's happening now is that Laura's leading the next version of Learning by Making, which is called STEM ACES. And it's an 8th grade curriculum, but it's activities that are layered on top of whatever they happen to be teaching. So we're hopeful that by doing this approach, we'll get wider adoption across the country. And because this is now a mid-phase grant, Laura is the PI on the largest single grant ever brought to Sonoma State. I'm so proud of her, $8 million. And we are working with people in Texas who Laura also met because of one of her other projects, Eclipse Mega Movie, that I'm not really going to talk about. And that's people at Angelo State University, and of course, WestEd, who I've worked with from the very beginning. They have always been the evaluators for all of the projects through the past 25, 6 years. And my most recent project is NASA's Neurodiversity Network. So it's been going, this is its 5th year out of 5. This is a program that focuses on the transition by high school students into college, and these students are on the autism spectrum. And so we have internships for these students that we pair them with NASA subject matter experts. We get applications from all over the country. We pick 20. It's very difficult. And we do redesign work. Yeah, we redesign existing NASA resources so that they work well with our intended audience. And we do our best. We let the teachers teach. We train the teachers. We let the teachers teach their students. And then we have this extensive debriefing process that we call co-design, where a couple students and the teacher tell us what they think of every single part, every single step of the activities they've been going through, and then we try to fix them so they work even better. And with the 4 years of internship projects, you can see most of them have been in astrophysics, but we've had a nice balance across all the different areas of science at NASA. And there I am posing with posing with Gort. Yet another telescope I get to pose with. And that was a Press Democrat article in February of 2021. So I'm now getting pretty much to the end, so I'm only a little bit late, not too bad. On a personal note, this is my current cast of critters, although I cheated on 2 of this is the pullet. The Buff Orpingtons were pullets when I took that picture, and now they're full-fledged chickens. And this is actually when one of my earlier chickens was a pullet, because I just got 2 pullets that looked pretty much like that, and I didn't have time to go take new pictures. But yes, I do have 5 horses. 2 of them are tiny. Right now, 6 chickens, a couple cats, and a 3-legged goat. Oh, and my dog, Toffee, of course. I want to thank everybody that I have worked with since 1982, the faculty and the staff of the department, also everyone in the EPO group, or EdEon, whichever one you want to call it. I would love to remember all the names of all the wonderful students that I've had, and if I saw the pictures, I mostly got their names, but just trying to remember people without seeing pictures is very difficult. But I really appreciate everybody, and I hope that I've helped you all. And a special thanks to my late husband, who definitely was my biggest supporter for 43 years. He was also the person that got us into the small satellite business. So, what's next? Well, I hope that someday NASA will come out with an announcement that I can write a proposal for that was supposed to come out in February so we can keep the N3 program going. But we know what we want to propose if we ever get the chance. We want to keep working with college students now, because we've done the high school to college transition. We want to work with some curriculum for college students. We want to have support for students who are not these incredibly brilliant kids that we've been working with that are all going to go off and get PhDs someday. Learning by Making, as I mentioned, has moved to 8th grade, and we're actively seeking partners in both California and Texas that are rural and high-need students. So if you know any middle school teachers in either one of those states in a rural area, please let us know. We'll go recruit them. And then my plan is to half retire, which is called FERP, the Faculty Early Retirement Program, August 17th. I guess it's not really that early, since I've been here much longer than anyone else has been on this campus, but that's what they call it. And I want to do some more traveling, like this trip that Tim and I just took to Firenze and came back with. Fun memories. But here's some last words of advice. The old timers will remember the Chicken Boy, because I was absolutely obsessed with Chicken Boy for quite a while. And if you haven't seen Chicken Boy the movie, just go to YouTube and type in Chicken Boy the movie, and you can watch the movie. It is fantastic. I love it. And I even though my life's work has been spent trying to figure out how to comprehend the universe, a la Einstein, or one of my many Einstein dolls, my last words to you really are, and it's nice to be important, but it's much more important to be nice, as evidenced by Chicken Boy.